the city of 1,000 minarets, the conqueror and the culture bearer. هنا القاهرة, هنا العرب. Hey everyone, welcome to Hona al-Arab. This week we depart to a land of many ancients. A land where under every other unturned stone, you're bound to find some priceless historical relic. This week, we visit Cairo, or as it's known in Arabic, Al-Qahira. Before we get to this week's topic, let's talk about the city itself. Cairo is old, like really old. We can trace her current self back to the early Islamic conquest of North Africa. Then the soon-to-be governor of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anh, conquered a Roman fortress on the banks of the Great Nile. Then he founded a city/garrison, which he dubbed Al-Fustat, or the Tent. This riverside military camp eventually evolved into the Fatimid capital, Qahirat al-Mu'izz, named after the caliph who founded it, Al-Mu'izz bi Amrillah. Of course, I'm skimming over large amounts of complicated history between the Abbasids, Umayyads, Ayyubids, and Fatimids, but you get the gist of it. Now, eventually, Cairo became one of the biggest medieval cities in the world. Her magnificence was only rivaled by Baghdad in grandeur, but then she eclipsed her Mesopotamian counterpart. Now, that's our main character. Let's dig into the meat of the episode: Cairean literature. So, Cairo is Arab through and through. This means that the main way that literature there was spread was through oral transmission. This is simply because Arab culture was, and really is, predominantly an oral one, with a heavy emphasis on poems. Eventually, as in the 19th century we find a written account of a form of popular culture, or literature really. A miller named Khalil had a small notebook with the stories of pre-Islamic figures like Antar ibn Shaddad and Dhat al-Himma. Antar's story was one about a dark-skinned boy born to an Arab father and a dark-skinned African slave. He was shunned by his tribe due to his mother's status, but eventually he gained some fame, respect, and freedom because of his skills in warfare. The main plot in Antar's story, besides his freeing, was his love for Abla, his elusive maiden, if you will. As for Dhat al-Himma, it's not as popular today, but the story tells the tale of a Umayyad-era heroine and their war with the Byzantines. Interestingly, the notebook also had some fictitious stories about Amr ibn al-As that were never recorded in any other source. Al-Sakhawi, an ancient historian, tells us that Khalil sold this notebook to Sheikh Badr al-Din al-Sharabdar, who in turn memorized these stories and then told them to an audience. However, Khalil and Sharabdar were not special. No, Cairo and other cities in the Middle East and North Africa were filled with these hakawatis, whose job was to tell tales in gatherings. Cairo's Khan Bain al-Qasrain area was particularly famous for this, having many hakawatis, alongside other forms of entertainment. Think of it like a circus area. Since these tales were oral, they were consumed mostly by common folk. As such, they were also tailored for them. Many of them had poetry inside their prose, as well as colloquialisms and family-friendly and inappropriate jokes. Stories like these, though popular, were not always well received. Alongside made-up tales about a character named Batal, literally hero in Arabic, they were condemned by Islamic scholars because they infused fiction and truth, which could technically be considered a lie. This is interesting, as it shows that scholars were not necessarily against fictitious literature, but rather only if it was used to twist reality. There is some discussion as to whether these tales can be considered literature or if they're just pop culture, because they were used like the latter, where many of them eventually developed into early references to be used in the Islamicate world. Think of them as modern movie references, really. These references were also used by influential figures, including the same scholars that didn't like them. But here's the catch. If you want to consider them literature, then you might as well throw 1001 Nights in that category too, as it was spread in the same fashion. But I should mention that though oral transmission was the norm, books were sold too, though they were mostly reserved for the upper echelons of society. One more side note, 1001 Nights was sold as a book back then, but it was actually closer to 270 nights. Anyway, we skip a bit of time. Well, a ton of time, to one of Cairo's most prominent and controversial literary figures, Taha Hussein. Husayn was born in 1889 in a poor community in southern Egypt. Because of his humble origins, his early life was plagued with poverty, disease, and misfortune. It would get much worse for him before it would improve, as a simple eye infection he got escalated, due to an unskilled makeshift doctor of the time, into full-on blindness. There is honestly an incredible story here of overcoming adversity and coming out on top, without having your disability stop you, or honestly even become the main center of attention around your person. But this isn't the point about Husayn. Despite his blindness, his father still sent him to the village school to learn the Quran and Islamic sciences. There, Husayn met graduates from Egypt's most prestigious Islamic university, Al-Azhar al-Sharif. Eventually, Husayn and his brother Ahmed left their village and set out to Al-Azhar in 1902. However, Husayn did not agree with many aspects of the university, both in curriculum and teaching methods. So, when the National University, now Cairo University, opened its doors, he took it as a sign and left for it in 1908. There, he studied the history of Egypt, languages, and philosophy in an Anglo curriculum. He graduated in 1914 with a doctorate on Abi Ala al-Ma'arri, an ancient atheist or atheist-adjacent Arab philosopher poet. Honestly, this is foreshadowing if I've ever seen some. Hussein was an incredible student, such that he won a scholarship to the Sorbonne. There, he conducted another doctorate in 1918, this time on the philosophy of Ibn Khaldun, alongside studying the Greek and Latin languages and French history at Montpellier University. Not sure that's how it's pronounced. His return to Egypt was nothing short of eventful, as 2 years later in 1922, it got its independence from the British Empire. And apparently, he was of the sentimental type, because he got a job teaching history at his old stomping grounds, the National University. After the university was taken into the public sector in 1925, he was promoted in 1928 to the Dean of the Faculty of the Arts and a Professor of Arabic Literature. Now, remember the Abi Ala al-Ma'arri thing? Well, Hussein landed himself in some hot water in 1923 when he wrote Fi al-Shi'r al-Jahili, or on pre-Islamic poetry. There, he made some pretty controversial claims about some Muslim scholars, linguists, and historians who wrote about pre-Islamic era, pretty much saying they lied. He said that they fabricated the entirety of pre-Islamic poetry and stories and legends and everything. People levied a ton of claims against him, including blasphemy and then eventually outright apostasy. This controversy eventually led him to be dismissed from his role as the dean. However, for some reason that didn't stay for long and he was reinstated. Now, he was more popular than ever and he was even given the nickname Amid al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, or the Dean of the Arabic language. Or, simply the Dean, which does sound really cool. His gradual upward momentum did not stop there, as he eventually became Egypt's Minister of Education in 1950 and remained so till 1952. Here, I think Hussein probably made the single most important decision of his life, one whose effects are arguably still felt to this day and is largely the best piece of his legacy. In 1951, he abolished all fees in all public schools and vocational secondary schools. This incredible decree meant that now millions and millions of Egyptians had access to education for the first time ever. Hussein knew from experience what living in poverty was like, and that it was the main obstacle between Egyptians and getting an education. Anyway, like many great literature figures of the time, Hussein wrote and edited newspapers. But the bulk of his work lay within the realm of Arabic literature, though he was also very much into education. His interest in literature was perhaps the only exceeded by one other facet of Hussein's life, his passion for the creation of an Egyptian nationalism. Now, Egypt had always been sort of a pioneer when it came to the introduction of nationalism in the Arab world, for better or for worse. But till this point, it had been mostly Arab nationalism, if a bit biased towards Egypt. So Hussein really was one of the first, if not the first, proponents of a nationalism that was strictly based on an Egyptian identity. Hussein's Egyptian identity was interesting. For him, the most important part of Egypt was her pharaonic past. He argued that everything other than that, no matter how entrenched it became in the collective Egyptian psyche, was nothing more than intrusions. This included Arabic and, by extension, Islam. Understandably, this was very controversial. But it is important to understand that Hussein was opposed to neither Islam nor Arabic. He just thought both of them as less intrinsic to the Egyptian identity, but still equally important. He even called them pillars of Egyptian society. I mean, ultimately, he studied and wrote about Arabic literature all his life. But I have some gripes with what he stood for. See, Hussein didn't want Egypt to stay shackled with Western chains. He figured that she could only progress culturally, scientifically, and socially if she broke from her curse of Western imitation. So far, so good, right? Seems like a classic post-colonial thought process. However, Hussein also stressed Egypt's ancient relationship with the Mediterranean. So, Europe by extension. He argued that the Egyptian mind and advancement were very much like their European counterparts. This ancient Hellenic connection was very important to him. That to me kind of screams colonial inferiority complex. It's as if he needed some sort of European connection to validate this idea of Egypt as a great power. As if Egypt, the Eastern Egypt, couldn't stand on her own 2 feet if she weren't connected to a Western power to hold her up. To be honest, it all sounded a bit too much like something Lord Cromer would say. Word for word, actually. This is the obligatory part where we talk about Orientalism, but I won't. I'll just refer you to Edward Said's Orientalism. There you can find Lord Cromer's speech about ancient Egypt and see how similar it is to Hussein's sentiments. Nonetheless, Hussein's story is one of great achievements, from being born in a Blackwater village in southern Egypt to France to becoming Egypt's Minister of Education and having his name immortalized in the Egyptian psyche. Though controversial, the man definitely left an impact. So, how about we turn the controversy up a bit? We turn to the last guest of today's Egyptian tale, a man of great renown, if not greater infamy, Naguib Mahfouz. Naguib was born to a relatively well-off middle-class family as the youngest of 7 kids. His childhood was incredibly important to the development of his thirst for knowledge and literary ability. His parents put incredible emphasis on education and learning. They gave him Western detective stories and historical novels to read, alongside some material by Egyptian writers in Arabic. His mom took him on regular trips to cultural sites in Egypt, as well as some national museums. Which honestly, it seems like could be very surprising if this kind of childhood did not bring up a great writer. The fruits of this upbringing sprouted incredibly early, as his first pieces of writing were in high school. There, he wrote essays, but after experimenting with short stories and seeing how easily they were to publish, he favored them for a while. Despite his clear proficiency in writing fiction, Mahfouz was way more interested in non-fiction and philosophy. In fact, his first ever essay was a philosophical one, called احتضار المعتقدات وتولد المعتقدات, or The Death and Birth of Doctrines, published in المجلة الجديدة. In his work, Mahfouz says that nothing is more natural than change and that it must occur when civilization happens. He also outlined the fact that man needs religion and faith for his inner peace. In this, we can begin to see the first glimpses of Mahfouz's ideology. And we need to highlight this because it's indispensable for deciphering his later more controversial work. Anyway, Mahfouz, like Husayn, lived through a very interesting time in Egyptian history. His era was one of westernization, read as modernization. And thus, many in his literary circles were influenced heavily by either capitalism or socialism and Marxism. Mahfouz was a more religious man than Husayn. He wanted to facilitate some sort of coexistence between his religion and these ideologies. His middle ground solution to this dilemma was a sort of socialism mixed with Islam. See, he found that socialism and by extension Marxism were way too materialistic. They took out any form of spirituality and replaced it with largely nothing. In his eyes, Egyptian society was fundamentally an Islamic one, and it would never accept something as spiritually bankrupt as pure socialism. So, he advocates for an Islamic socialism that blended the material truth of socialism and the spiritual truth of Islam. So Mahfouz was not entirely apolitical. How did he dispense his political thoughts? Well, he took a page from George Zaidan, which, hello foreshadowing by the way, and wrote some historical novels. In these novels, Mahfouz would draw parallels between his own time and ancient history as a way to indirectly educate the masses about their past, present, and possible future. His bibliography is insane. Just as an example, between 1945 and 1951, he released 5 whole novels. But these newer books took a different path. He ditched historical allegory and straight up wrote about his time. Analyzing these books, we can find one very consistent theme through all of them: class struggle and structures. In these books, Mahfouz weaves tales about how the upper and lower classes interacted in urban, condensed Cairo. He put a very clear emphasis on the gap between them and criticized it very harshly. Clearly, this was very indicative of the reality he lived in, as his Egypt was very uncertain, whether between independence or the socialism wave that swept through it. This era of Mahfouzian literature includes books like Qahira and Zuqaq al-Middaq. Now, if any of you are any bit familiar with Mahfouz, you must have noticed that there's one work, his most popular one no less, that I haven't brought up yet. Well, here it is. Let's talk أولاد حارتنا, or Children of Gabalawi. Mahfouz had some very lofty goals for this project. This quasi-historical allegorical novel attempted to recount the entirety of human history through the life cycle of one Egyptian neighborhood, or a hara. On its own, this wouldn't have been very memorable and wouldn't have satisfied Mahfouz's ambitions. So, he put in standings for all of the Abrahamic prophets and God. Yeah. In the book, the father of the Ali is Gabalawi. He's imposing, mysterious, and often harsh. His sons, Adham and Idris, are stand-ins for Adam alayhi salam and Iblis, Satan. Adam's descendants, Gabal, Rifa'a, and Qasim are stand-ins for prophets Musa, Isa, Jesus, and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam jami'an. The last character introduced is Arafah, a metaphor for science. People obviously had a problem with this, and I won't get into whether it's religiously permissible or not, as I'm not a scholar, but I'm concerned with the horrible level of media literacy people had, and honestly, might still have. Mahfouz portrayed all the prophets as incredibly just men who did nothing but absolute good for their communities. Likewise, his portrayal for God wasn't a commentary on God, but is what people thought of God. I mean, eventually Arafah comes out at the end of the story and it inadvertently causes at the end of Gabalawi, which he regrets immediately, saying that the villains of the alley immediately took advantage of it. So, does this remind you of anything? Yes, it's Nietzsche's Death of God. But people never understood this. Mahfouz literally tried to point out in the entire book that religion was good and that a society without God can never flourish, but people couldn't see past the allegory. Even if you fundamentally disagree with the publishing of the book, or even subject matter, you're more than free to do so. But at the very least, understand it. Don't attack the man's person when you're trying to attack his work. One must separate the work from its creator in order to dismantle its arguments in a civil discussion or debate. Despite this, and the fact that he had defended religion from materialists many times, Mahfouz was very viciously attacked for his work. It got so bad that in 1994, a man stabbed Mahfouz in the neck. The darkest part about this, and the funniest part about this, the attacker had never even read the damn book. He simply had acted on extremist ideals. Honestly, if there's one thing to take from this story, is that media literacy is incredibly important. As well as coherent literature, analysis, and civil discussion, books can be very powerful mediums that spark conversation and even real-world change, but only if we let them. Otherwise, writers will continue to be attacked verbally and physically because of baseless claims. Because there's no reason that a man who spent a good majority of his life defending Islam should be considered an infidel over someone's failure to grasp his allegory. Mahfouz eventually recovered from his attack and slowed down a bit as he couldn't use his silence for as long. So he only wrote the occasional fictional piece, but mainly focused on producing movies and TV shows that everyone in the Arab world has seen. That's all I have for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and fi amanillah.